Continue this conversation right now. Fran Townsend is here, the president of the Counter Extremism Project, as well as the former Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to President Bush. Also, Michael German is here, author of Thinking Like a Terrorist. He's also a former FBI counterterrorism officer. Good morning to both of you. How much of this do you, I mean, we were talking about both of these covers this morning. How much of this is a policy and intelligence failure, if you will, and how much of this is a gun control issue, if you will, or is it both?
There's a lot, right? So there's a lot. All of it is wrapped up in this. But I think, you know, look, when 9/11 happened, we weren't talking about controlling box cutters, right? We are talking about gun control because, understandably, the access to guns in this country, and we see these mass shootings, and an assault rifle is so lethal, and its capability to wreak the harm that we've seen in Orlando. It's understandable we're going to talk about this now. On the other hand, we do need to understand what did investigators know and didn't know. How did they make the judgments they made? You know, Director Comey has said he's got terrorism investigations in all of the 50 states. He doesn't have the resources to cover all of those full time, and so we've got to make some judgments. Are we willing to give the FBI more resources to give more coverage to these cases? And the other thing is, do they have the legal tools? The Attorney General guidelines inhibit their ability to look at things like social media posts that, if they had considered, they might have understood better.
And the answer to that question is yes, I imagine.
That's right.
For both.
That's right. Yes. Yes, we have to talk about both.
No, not I'm saying in terms of what's missing, the ability to look at social media and look at all of these other issues.
Yes.
What's missing in all of this?
Well, I think part of the problem is that we've opened the aperture too wide.
Okay.
So we're looking at too many people who we really don't have a reasonable basis to be looking at. And that creates two problems. One, it diverts law enforcement resources from real threats. But number two, it inures the agents to false alarms. Now, there's a reason why it's against the law to pull the fire alarm in the building and get the fire department to come here. It's because we know it dulls the response when there's not a real fire. Our counterterrorism system is constantly ringing false alarms so often that it's hard to respond and acknowledge what is a real threat.
This guy would have fallen in the second camp, the camp of people who we didn't think were important to follow up on. How do you narrow the aperture, but at the same time follow up on real potential
on the right people,
threats?
right?
It's not an easy task, but you have to do it somehow, right? I think first we have to recognize that there are a lot of bad people in the world, and unfortunately, no matter how good law enforcement is, they're not going to be able to stop every bad thing from happening. But on the other hand, you have to have some reasonable triage, right? If you have triage on the front end where you say, we accumulate this evidence before we start using investigative resources, you are going to focus more sharply on the people who are actually doing things that would cause somebody.
You said we're looking at too many people. Do we need, you're an ACLU guy, I can't imagine you're saying we need to profile to narrow the amount of people that we're looking at.
No, and that's a big part of the problem. A lot of the terrorism research that has been conducted, tens of millions of dollars being funded into it, is really of extremely poor quality. So we are producing these profiles that aren't based on objective evidence about the people who commit these crimes, and instead are based on these specious ideas that people radicalize, that there's this internal process. You know, if this person...
Why is that a specious idea if that's what's happening in this instance?
Well, that's the whole thing, right? Here we talk about the radicalization, where if this person didn't have a particular ideological hook that we put it on, we wouldn't be talking about what was his criminalization process. What the evidence shows when they study actual terrorists is that they don't go through any kind of a process that is any way can be modeled, that these are very individual decisions, usually brought about with very much like this
and
case.
It sounds like you're throwing up your hands.
Right.
No, absolutely not.
In some respects, I mean, what you can do is, I think the question to ask in this particular case is, if you evaluated him 3 times, and none of those times did you believe he was other than aspirational, right? He was a blowhard. Why didn't we pick up when he bought the weapons a week ago, right? That was a disruption opportunity that was missed. And so to your point, if there's a failure here, the failure is an understanding when he made that move and who understood that and why weren't the dots connected then.
So is that a systems failure, meaning is this about building software programs and databases that are connected? Is that what didn't happen in this instance?
Well, we don't know yet,
We don't know.
right? But the fact is, if you're relying on human beings to share information, it's too slow and it's prone to failure. It ought to be that if the FBI's interviewed you 3 times on a counterterrorism investigation and you buy a weapon, that trips something in the federal system to get the attention of investigators so they can then turn their limited resources to go back and look at you again.
The problem, though, if you're talking, I mean, take it out of the gun control issue. I mean, you could put a pause in terms of how long it takes to buy a gun. But if you go to Home Depot and you buy a box of nails, unfortunately, it's not necessarily going to trigger the FBI.
No, that's right. I mean, and this is, look, interrupting this cycle is actually quite difficult. And you're not going to be, there's no 100% solution. But I do think that there are things we can do and we ought to be looking at now to improve the way we investigate.
And I think we have to keep in mind that there are roughly 15,000 homicides in the United States each year. A third of those go unsolved. Half of the violent crime overall goes unsolved. So if we put resources into solving those crimes, number one, we're probably going to trip over more people who are actually going to do harm than we would using these mass surveillance techniques. But number two, we're going to make all American communities safer from violence, and that's really the ultimate goal of law enforcement.
How much money needs to go? How much more money needs to go to the FBI?
Well, it's really a question for the Director Comey, right? He's got 14,000 sworn agents. He's got 19 or 20,000 administrative support and analysts. The question is, the number is going to be determined by the mix of analysts, investigators that you need.
Right. And I think we have to keep in mind that throwing money at a problem is not always the answer. One of the big problems is we haven't done an evaluation of our counterterrorism methods to determine what's helpful and what's not. And if we keep throwing money in programs that aren't successful in identifying threats, that's not going to make anyone safer.
Okay, Francis, Mike, thank you guys.